Chapter 3. He who labors and thrives spins gold. Mexican proverb. Sylvia, Westminster, California. Sylvia studied Keiko carefully. The doll was about 6 inches tall and had tiny, delicate porcelain hands. Sylvia rested one of Keiko's hands against the tip of her finger. The doll's fingers were long and thin and white, posed in a relaxed and graceful position, and the thumbs slightly extended away from the other fingers. Her hands look real, Sylvia thought. Sylvia held out her own hand and tried to imitate Keiko's pose. It didn't look right. Her own hand seemed so clumsy when she compared it to the delicate dancer's. Sylvia began to examine her hands as if she had never seen them before, inspecting the lines that ran across her palms as well as the intricate, fine swirls of her fingerprints. Her hands belonged to her and no one else. No two like them existed anywhere on earth. Yet others used their own hands to hold her and her brothers back and even wave them away. She wiggled her fingers, imagining them darting at a typewriter like the secretaries at Westminster School. She used both hands to pretend that she was dicing vegetables on a chopping block. Chop, chop, chop. She thought about her mother's strong brown hand, so skilled, so fast at slicing onions or braiding hair. She could never think of her mother's busy hands being as still as Keiko's. Then she thought of her father's powerful hands. They were never idle either. In the fields, his hands constantly moved, tirelessly reaching and snipping fruit from the trees or slashing asparagus stalks in a single swift motion. Sylvia imitated the motion of her father's hands, flashing back and forth from fruit to burlap bag. His strong hands had a story to tell. Whenever Sylvia's father came in from the fields, he scrupulously scrubbed his hands and neatly trimmed fingernails, making them as clean as a businessman's. But his hands could not keep secrets. He couldn't soften the thick, leathery calluses that identified him as a man used to hard physical work. Knock, knock, knock. Sylvia jumped. She hadn't heard her brothers come to her bedroom door. 7-year-old Gonzalo Jr. peeked inside. Jerome, 2 years younger, slipped in behind him. "Mom wants you to come with us," Gonzalo said. "Dad's home." Sylvia put Keiko on her bedside table, carefully leaning her against the lamp. "See you later," Sylvia promised before following her brothers to the dining room. Her parents were already sitting at the table, talking. Her father wore pleated brown slacks and a freshly iron-collared white shirt. His tie was loosened around his neck, and his suit coat hung on the back of the chair. Sylvia knew that earlier their father had gone to talk to someone about getting them into Westminster School. Although she was eager to find out what had happened, she knew her father would tell them in his own time. Jerome was not so patient. "What did the man say?" he asked. "Do we get to go to Westminster? School started in just a few days." Sylvia's father turned toward him. "That's what your mother and I are talking about. The man I had an appointment with this morning is Richard Harris, the superintendent of schools in Westminster. I told Mr. Harris that we do not live in the barrio." Westminster's barrio was the poor neighborhood near Olive Street and Hoover School. "I told him that we live on the Munamitsu farm on the other side of town, and closer to Westminster School," Sylvia's mother added. "Yes," her father agreed, "closer to Westminster School." He paused. Everyone waited, the silence slowing time. "But Superintendent Harris said we still need to register at Hoover School," Sylvia's father said with a shrug of his shoulders. Sylvia's stomach flip-flopped. This was not how she had expected. "That's not fair," she blurted out. "The children belong at Westminster School," her mother declared. I know," her father said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "Mr. Harris said, the problem is that if we admit your children, then other parents will want their children to go to Westminster too." "And what's wrong with that?" Sylvia's mother demanded. "Nothing," her husband replied. "Of course nothing. We all want what is best for our children." Sylvia's father looked down at his hands and inspected his fingernails. He swiped the thumbnail of his right hand under the perfect white crescents of the nails on his left hand. It was a nervous habit. Sylvia could see that his fingernails were as clean as ever. "Mr. Harris told me that he knew that times were changing," Sylvia's father said. "He said that he would talk to some people at the Board of Education and see if anything could be done." "So what are we going to do now?" Sylvia's mother asked. "We will enroll the children at Hoover School." Her father's voice was decisive. "But this is not the end." Several days later, on the first day of school, Sylvia woke up before her alarm rang. She stared at the ceiling, anxious about the day ahead. Will I like my teacher, she wondered? Will I make friends in my new class? Even if Hoover School isn't as fancy as Westminster School, it surely will be nicer than my last school. As the sun finally peeked over the mountains, Sylvia put on her first day outfit, a navy jumper and short-sleeved white cotton shirt with a Peter Pan collar. She wore her new shoes and carried a brand new 3-ring binder filled with ruled paper. Inside a small pouch, she had put 5 yellow pencils as well as 2 bubblegum pink erasers, which were still perfect, no gray smudges. When Sylvia stepped out of her bedroom, she heard her mother singing. Her mother was like a radio that switched on in the morning and turned off late at night. Singing and humming were as natural to her as the rhythm of her own heartbeat. Even over the past few days, when the family had been worried about the start of the school year, she had kept singing. Today, Sylvia recognized her mother's favorite song, Cielito Lindo, Pretty Sweetheart. Ay, canta y no llores, porque cantando se alegran. Cielito lindo los corazones, ay. Sing a tune and don't cry, because through singing, my dear, we can bring cheer to our hearts. That morning, Sylvia's mother sang while she was fixing breakfast. She sang while weaving Sylvia's hair into 2 long braids and while tying navy blue ribbons in Sylvia's hair. But her mother's singing couldn't hide the fact that today was a day of disappointment. Sylvia was getting ready to go to a school that was a bitter letdown to her parents and herself. It was only her little brothers who didn't seem to give the matter much thought. One school was the same as another to them. As long as there was recess and not too much homework, they would be content. At first, Sylvia had thought Virginia and Alice would be with her on the first day, but right after the incident at the Westminster School, their father got a job as a foreman at a farm about 30 miles away, and they had moved. Sylvia and her brothers were left to face Hoover School alone. Okay, her mother said when it was finally time to leave. Bésame, she ordered with a smile. Kiss me. Sylvia kissed her mother on the cheek, then walked with her brothers on the hard-packed earth edging the fields to the main road, where the school bus would pick them up. Jerome kicked a rock and followed it from point to point, staying more or less on the path. In the distance, Sylvia saw 2 girls already waiting for the bus. One of them looked close to her age, the other a bit younger. Those girls probably go to Westminster, she thought. Holding her notebook against her chest, Sylvia walked right up to the older girl. Hello, she said, offering a small smile and a slight nod, hoping her nervousness didn't show. Then she asked, Is this where we catch the school bus? Hi, the older girl said. She had shoulder-length honey-colored hair pulled back in a ponytail. Don't worry, you're in the right place and just in time. Just then, a golden-yellow school bus chugged up the road and groaned to a halt in front of the waiting group. Sylvia stood back, allowing the other kids to board first. She wanted to see where everyone else sat before choosing a place of her own. She scanned the unfamiliar faces on the bus. Everyone was white. Everyone. Sylvia paused next to the seat where the girl who'd spoken to her was sitting, but then she moved on, afraid the girl might be saving the space for someone else. As the bus lurched into motion, she headed unsteadily to the back and sat on a seat across from her brothers. She murmured to Gonzalo, Are we on the wrong bus? Her brother grinned. Don't you think the driver would have said something? Maybe there's a separate bus for kids going to Hoover School. But Gonzalo wasn't interested in her concerns. He turned to whisper something to Jerome, and the 2 boys burst out laughing. Although Sylvia knew that most Mexicans lived in the barrio on the other side of Westminster, she hadn't dreamed that she and her brothers would be the only brown-skinned passengers on the bus. Several stops later, the bus pulled up in front of the Westminster School. She looked longingly at the lovely buildings and the fully equipped playground. Stay here, Sylvia told her brothers, who had started to get up and follow the other children. The 3 of them sat in their seats while everyone else stepped off and headed to the entrance. What are y'all waiting for? The bus driver asked impatiently, looking at Sylvia and her brothers in the rearview mirror. He wore sunglasses that hid any expression. This isn't our school, Sylvia responded, her voice higher than usual. We go to Hoover School. Yeah, I know. Now he sounded bored. He had slipped off his sunglasses and was polishing them with the corner of a handkerchief. Sylvia didn't know what to do. She looked at her brothers, who looked back uncertainly. You walk the rest of the way, the driver said. Oh, thank you. We didn't know. Clutching her binder, Sylvia exited the bus, followed by Gonzalo and Jerome. She looked up and down the street, searching for a clue that would tell her which way to go. "We don't know the way," she called back to the driver as he was reaching for the lever that would close the bus door. "Go on down to Olive Street and turn right," the man said, pointing. "Hoover School is at Olive and Maple. You can't miss it." The door closed and the bus pulled away from the curb. The school's right next to the barrio, Sylvia thought, her heart sinking even lower. She and her brothers walked together, lost in their own thoughts. The first day of third grade isn't starting out the way I had hoped, Sylvia admitted to herself. Gonzalo kept his head down and his hands shoved deep in his pants pocket. Even Jerome couldn't seem to find the energy to kick a rock. After about 10 minutes of trudging along, Gonzalo said, "There it is." Further along the street was a run-down, dirty, clapboard building next to a cow pasture. Loose dirt and clumps of weeds surrounded the school. An empty field stood in for a playground, sure to be dusty in warm weather, a sea of mud when it rained. No guardian trees and thick green lawns here. A faded, hand-painted sign posted above the building's front door read, Hoover School. The smell of cow manure filled Sylvia's nose. This place was going to be just like all the other Mexican schools she and her brothers had attended. Nothing but out-of-date hand-me-down textbooks with pages torn or missing and secondhand desks scarred with pencil marks and initials. Once again, we get the leftovers. When Sylvia's class broke for lunch, there were already several other groups outside on the back field. Sylvia sat under a shade tree with Ramona, a girl from her class who lived in the barrio. "Shoo!" Sylvia cried, swishing at a swarm of flies. "Leave me alone." A fly landed on her bologna sandwich as she took a bite. "They come from the cow pasture. You'll get used to it," Ramona said. "They never go away." "I'll never get used to it," Sylvia said. "What other choice is there?" "Westminster School," she wanted to answer, but it wasn't a choice. At least not for her and Ramona. Instead, she just shrugged, waved off another fly, and took a second bite of her sandwich. As she was finishing, she noticed a younger boy approach the wire fence that surrounded the pasture, keeping the cows inside and the children out. One wire strung along the top of the fence glinted wickedly in the sunlight. The boy was tentatively reaching his hand toward that wire. "Ah!" the boy cried, loud enough to silence the yard, at least for a moment. The boy pulled his hand back and shook it violently. Some of the older boys laughed. "It's electric," said Ramona. "Someone probably dared him to touch it. He's in second grade. This is his first year at Hoover. It always happens to a new kid on the first day of school." Sylvia rubbed her hands together, imagining a jolt of electricity that must have passed through the boy's hand. Who would put an electric fence next to a school? At the end of the day, Sylvia walked with her brothers back to Westminster School. When they arrived, the other kids were already boarding the bus. Sylvia slipped into a vacant seat in the middle of the bus. Again, Gonzalo and Jerome sat across the aisle. On the ride home, Sylvia thought about that second grader. She remembered his cry, and then his pain, embarrassment, and shame. She leaned over and whispered to Jerome and Gonzalo, "Tomorrow, at school, whatever you do, don't touch the fence." From the looks on her brothers' faces, she could tell they already knew. Sylvia looked out the window as they passed one farm after another, each separated from its neighbor by a fence. Split rail fences, electric fences, barbed wire fences, keeping some in, shutting others out. Sylvia replayed the moment when she'd seen the boy get shocked. She, too, had once been shocked while plugging in a lamp, so she knew the burning jolt he must have felt. Her mind wandered to her father and his efforts to break down the barrier that kept her from Westminster School, from a good education. He's not going to back down, Sylvia thought, but I sure hope he doesn't get burned. Chapter 4. If you stand up like a nail, you will get hammered down. Japanese proverb. Aki, Westminster and Santa Ana, California. The day after Aki hid her doll and began her final packing, she came home from school to find her mother standing at the sink, slicing cabbage for kuroke, Japanese croquettes. Aki dropped her book bag on the dining room table and went into the kitchen to get a glass of water. Her mother didn't look up. She didn't say welcome home or how was your day. She stood silently, chopping and re-chopping the greens. For a moment, there was only the faint crunch of cabbage leaves on the cutting board. When she stopped, Aki saw her mother wipe her cheek with the back of her hand. "What is it?" Aki asked. "It's Pop," her mother said, her voice breaking. She cleared her throat and started again. He's been taken to a camp. She spoke in a whisper, so sad and so faint that Aki could hardly hear. What? He was taken to a camp, her mother repeated. When? Several men came for him this morning after you left for school. As if from very far off, Aki heard the rush of water pouring into the sink and smelled the open bottle of sesame oil on the counter. The loose hair at the nape of her mother's neck, the blade of the knife in the white sink, the texture of her mother's dress, the light blue one with white piping at the collar, all came into focus, sharp focus, like a snapshot of this moment that she would never, ever be able to forget. Aki didn't know how long she hesitated before saying, I thought we were going to be together. I did too, her mother wiped her cheek again. And we will be. When? Aki repeated. I don't know. I don't know exactly when, but he will be back. Her mother's voice grew stronger as she spoke. Now tears flowed down Aki's face, and she let them. Her mother pulled her close. Aki put her arms around her mother's tiny waist, and they leaned into each other, holding each other up. She whispered, I didn't get to say goodbye. The realization struck her like a slap. Her father was gone, and she hadn't been able to hug him or tell him, I love you. No goodbyes, her mother said, her voice firm now. No sayonaras. At that moment, Aki could imagine what her father would say if he were there. He would pat her on the shoulder and say, be strong. She could find strength in that. Did I see him in the kitchen this morning? What were his last words to me? She wanted a perfect picture of him in her mind to hang on to. But her mind was blank. I miss him already, Aki whispered. I do too. Aki and her mother were quiet for a while. I still don't understand, Aki finally asked. Why did they come just for Pop? They took some of the men first, her mother said. Newspaper reporters, teachers, businessmen like Pop. Men they thought might be a threat. A threat? Aki echoed. Pop isn't a threat to anyone. If he is, then why didn't they take all of us? Aren't we all threats? I know, her mother said. But the people who make the rules don't know. They're scared of anyone who's Japanese. Even us? Even us, Aki's mother shook her head. What about Seiko? At age 17, Aki's older brother was almost a man. Ever since he was a little boy, he had helped his father run the farm, going with his father to the bank to translate back and forth between Japanese and English. He'll be with us, but at a different camp. Aki welcomed this small bit of good news. We will be leaving in a couple of days, Aki's mother nodded, for a place called Poston in Arizona. Poston, Aki thought, the word on the luggage tag on that too small suitcase. That night, Aki tossed and turned, waking before dawn, feverish and thirsty. She called for her mother, who entered the bedroom and turned on the overhead light. The brightness hurt, and she had to squint until her eyes adjusted to the glare. Her mother's eyes were swollen and red. Aki wondered whether her mother had slept at all, or if she had spent the night crying. Are you sick? Aki's mother asked. Let me look at you. She felt Aki's face and neck and then lifted her nightgown. Oh no, her mother said. Aki's legs and torso were covered with tiny red spots, as if she had been attacked by a swarm of hungry mosquitoes. Chicken pox. Why now? Aki had hoped to get chicken pox the year before, when several of her friends came down with it and got to stay home from school for a couple of weeks. Aki didn't want to be sick now. She didn't want to give her mother anything more to worry about. What will happen to me? Aki asked. You must not scratch, her mother said. Let me get a thermometer and lotion for the itching. You can have an oatmeal bath in the morning. But Aki couldn't help asking again, what's going to happen to me? You'll be fine in a week or two, her mother said. No, what's going to happen to me when you leave for the camp? Aki's mother stared at her a moment. Her face sagged. I don't know. I'll find out what to do about that in the morning. Aki tried not to scratch. At least we have something new to think about instead of Pop and packing in Poston. Aki heard her mother rummaging in the bathroom medicine cabinet. She returned with a calamine lotion and dabbed it on the reddest spots. Soon the itching stopped, long enough for Aki to fall asleep. When Aki finally awoke in the morning, her mother was leaning over her. How are you feeling? Itchy, Aki said, really itchy. Aki's mother began to fold the blanket on the end of the bed. I'm afraid there isn't much time. She looked at Aki and then at the suitcase next to the bed. I talked to the man at the civil control station. I asked if we could stay until you were better, but he said no. We have to go now. But I'm sick. You must go to the hospital in Santa Ana, and Seiko and I must go ahead on to Boston. They don't want the chicken pox to spread all through the camp. I have to go to the hospital by myself? Aki knew she sounded like a whining baby, but she couldn't help herself. First, Pop gone. Now, even more separation. She reached for her mother's hand. Don't be afraid, Aki's mother said. In the hospital, the nurses will bring you food on a tray so that you can eat in your bed. Aki knew that her mother was trying to put on a cheerful face for her, and silently she resolved, I will try to be happy, Mom, for you. But all she really wanted was to have her father back, to stay on the farm, to go back to school, to have things be the way they'd been before the evacuation. But what I want doesn't matter. That afternoon, when the front door clicked shut behind her, Aki knew she was leaving behind everything that was familiar and comfortable. It was as though she were walking away from her life. Aki's mother set the suitcase next to the empty bed in the hospital room. Aki looked down at the Japanese girl in the next bed. She could tell by the red splotches on her roommate's face and arms that she had chickenpox too. The girls greeted each other while Aki's mother unpacked some of the items from the suitcase. When her mother could find nothing more to do, she said, well, I better let you two girls get some rest. Aki felt her stomach flutter. Aki's mother put her arms around her and held her close. She didn't say goodbye. I will see you soon. Then she leaned over and kissed Aki on the top of her head and whispered in her ear, Gaman, the Japanese word for be brave, be strong. Aki looked up at her mother with tears in her eyes. Her mother's eyes were wet too. I will not cry. I will not cry, Aki chanted to herself. I will not embarrass my mother, not in front of a stranger. Aki's mother let go, and Aki felt her mother's warmth fade away. Do you want to play checkers? Aki's new roommate, Yuki, asked before Aki's mother had left the room. Aki tried to make her voice sound cheerful. Okay. As Yuki began to set up the game on one of the bedside tables, Aki strained to hear the sound of her mother's heels striking the linoleum floor in the hall. She listened long after the footsteps had faded away. Which camp are you going to? Yuki asked. Boston. Me too. Yuki divided the checkers into piles of red and black. My family has already gone. What have they told you about it? Nothing, the girl said. She stacked the checkers to make sure the piles were even and all the pieces were there. I just got here yesterday. My mother says we'll find out when we get there. Maybe we'll be neighbors, Aki said. I hope so, said Yuki. Do you want to be red or black? It doesn't matter. Yuki turned the board so that the red checkers were on Aki's side. Let's play. Aki and her new friend spent the next 2 weeks playing games, reading, and drawing pictures of themselves covered with red spots. For Aki, the quiet nights when there was nothing to distract her were the hardest. She tried to convince herself that nothing had changed, that she would go home to find Seiko and her parents sitting at their dining room table. But deep inside, she knew it wasn't true. Once she recovered from the chicken pox, she wasn't going home. Her father wasn't waiting for her. In the dark hospital room, Aki would think these things and cry silent tears, private tears, the kind that left no trace except for a wet spot on the pillow that dried before morning. A nurse accompanied Aki on the long trade ride out to Boston. Soldiers wearing tan uniforms and carrying duffel bags waited on the platform as the train pulled away. They each have one duffel bag, Aki noticed, only what they can carry. Isn't this exciting? The nurse said. You'll be able to see your parents soon. Aki nodded and gave a tight-lipped smile. Not Pop. The nurse reached for the Saturday Evening Post and soon settled into reading her magazine. Aki gazed out the window, watching the lush green of the California growing country turn into the dry, dusty, bleak Arizona desert. Who can live out here? When the train pulled into the station, Aki hungrily searched faces in the crowd on the platform looking for her mother. Aki didn't trust her eyes at first. Her mother was standing on the platform weeping. Aki had never seen her mother cry in public before. What has Boston done to her? Aki wondered as fresh fears crowded into her imagination. The train squealed to a halt and passengers rose and began to collect their belongings. The nurse took Aki's suitcase in one hand and Aki's hand in the other, and together they made their way out into the crowd. As soon as Aki saw her mother again, she broke free and rushed to her. They clung to each other, forcing the horde of strangers to flow around them. She felt her mother's soft hands stroking her hair, and she let herself feel how much she had missed her. Then Aki said goodbye to the nurse, picked up her suitcase, and took her mother's hand. She missed her father. She missed her home. She missed the life she used to have. But when she felt her mother's hand in hers, she knew that she was ready to face Poston.